I'd like to speak for a few minutes about 3 steps to fruitful living. And I'd like to read some verses from John's Gospel, chapter 15. The words of the Lord Jesus in the upper room to his disciples. And he says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vinedresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You're already clean because of the word which I've spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this, my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so will you be my disciples. Now, there are 2 main passages in the subject of being fruitful in the New Testament, and the first is this passage, and the other is Galatians chapter 5. I'd like to think with you carefully about these verses. They've been greatly misunderstood. People have confusion on some of these verses and wonder if it's possible for a person who's put their trust in the Lord Jesus to somehow fall into such spiritual decay that they're cut off, cast away, burned, whatever the case might be. These are important issues, and we need to think carefully about each phrase given to us in this little section. So step 1, we need to grasp the purpose of growing vines. Seems rather simple, doesn't it? But it isn't for producing leaves or producing shoots. It's for producing sweet grapes. In Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 1, Isaiah sings a sad song about God's unrequited love. He describes how God took Israel like a wild vine out of Egypt, brought it to Israel and planted it there and cared for it, put a wall around it, set up a watchtower, cultivated it. But in the end, all he got were sour grapes, wild grapes. The word that's actually used there for wild grapes describes the fruit of the ginkgo tree, and it's actually the word for stinkberries. And stinkberries have butyric acid in them. And I don't mean to be indelicate, but it's the same acid that's in rancid butter and vomit. So he's saying, you make me sick. I did everything for you, and look what happened. So we have to understand, what is this bit about Israel being a vine? This is their national history as a vine. They went into Egypt a family, they came out a nation. And this was God's intention. He raised up the nation of Israel as a divine protest against the idea that the universe was run by impersonal force working on mindless matter. The nations had begun to worship simply the forces of nature, the passion of love, the force of the sea, the winds, fertility, and they forgot that behind the universe was a personal God. And so God said, what I'm going to do is take this ragtag bunch of labor camp slaves and bring them into a strategic location. If you look at a map, you'll see the Fertile Crescent, as it's called, links up the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, the Jordan River Valley, and the Nile River Valley. And the superpowers of the ancient world were at either end of that arc. And Israel was in this little land bridge, the Levant. If everything to the west is blue, it's the Mediterranean. Everything to the east is brown, it's the Arabian Desert. And there's a little green swath along the edge, the Levant coast, that provided this land bridge between Africa and Asia and Europe. And so Israel, they were not travelers, but they were planted by the side of the road so that these nations that would travel back and forth through the land of Israel, wandering through this desert world, would come to this beautiful garden in which were growing the most luscious fruits, the fruits of divine character manifested through the nation of Israel. And people would say, how do you grow grapes like this in the desert? And they would be able to explain that the secret was that their roots were in God. And they were drawing their resources from God. And they would draw people to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and fulfill God's desire that through Abraham, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So this was God's purpose for Israel. And what is God's purpose for you? Well, it's very similar, isn't it? To bear such sweet fruit in a world full of stinkberries that people will be compelled to ask the reason of the hope within you. And you'll be able to lead them from your little branch back to the vine and explain to them that it is Christ in you, the hope of glory. That the transformation of your life is not related to you. That you are a branch in the vine, and it is the life of Christ, like the sap of the vine, that carries the life force to you and makes it possible for you to produce these sweet grapes. When we understand God's purpose for Israel, we understand the first part of verse 2. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. The phrase "in me" should be understood in a larger context than simply the church. The Lord Jesus did not become the vine at his incarnation. He always was the vine. Who was Abraham growing on when he rejoiced to see my day and was glad? Who was David growing on when he produced these luscious bunches of grapes that we call the Messianic Psalms? They were drawing their resources from the Messiah. There were, however, many people who were connected to Jesus through the nation of Israel that had no life in them. The Jews had the idea that the solution to the problem of Israel was to cut off Jesus. But Jesus said, no, I'm not going to be cut off. You're going to be cut off. I'm the vine. And these dead branches, those who had a relationship with the Messiah through the nation of Israel, but had no relationship with him through faith. And the Apostle Paul explains this in the book of Romans when he says that Abraham has two kinds of children. Those who are not of the circumcision, in other words, Gentiles, who have the faith of Abraham, and those who are of the circumcision, in other words, from the nation of Israel, who have the faith of Abraham. It's only through faith that we have a living relationship with God. Now, when we understand God's purposes for you and me, we understand the second half of verse 2. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes that it might bear more fruit. And so the practical solution or conclusion to step 1 is that when I get what God is doing in our lives, in other words, he's not making us showy plants with lots of leaves and suckers. The plant is not an end in itself. The fruit is the end. The manifestation of the character of God through his people, that's the end. letting people know what God is like. God's had a lot of bad press. People have bad ideas about God. And we're his local reps. And we have the opportunity, by bearing the fruit, the character of God, to have people have sweet thoughts about God. That's the idea. And so when we get that, then we're willing to let him prune us. Notice that it's the Father. My Father is the vine dresser. The Father himself loves you. The Father cares about you. And he is only going to cut away anything that would sap the energy of the believer from producing more fruit. These suckers that grow are the healthiest looking part of the plant. They're always the greenest, the healthiest. If you're reluctant to cut them away, you will keep the plant from bearing fruit. It's only when they're cut away. They always take, they never give. They never produce fruit. And these sucker attitudes that we have that sap our life and energy, the Father reaches down and says, I'm going to trim this away for your own good. And when we learn to trust him, we learn to appreciate the pruning because we know it's going to lead to more fruit.